Hello, my students. So let's go ahead and begin our conversation. All right. So so here it says chapter 1, and the reason being is because typically this course has a book, but we're not using the book in this session. So just know that chapter 1, it's lecture 1. Okay. Um, let's go ahead and get started. So the objectives, hold on, I think you might see what, okay, there. So the objectives is to identify social changes that, how social changes have meaning and by a perspective of a sociologist, right? So identify social changes by sociologists in the way we interpret these changes. And we're going to talk about society and also the global age and what this entails for who we are, and specifically where do we belong, right, in relation to each other and to to um, um, to a system that is part of our community, right? And so we're going to talk about globalization, at least at an introductory level, and also McDonaldization and what that entails. McDonaldization has to do how organizations, institutions operate, right? And also what makes sociology unique, right? And because sociology is a science, so we're going to kind of explore what does that entail, right? And also how sociology is very different from common sense, and why common sense from a sociological frame is problematic. So what is sociology? Sociology is the study of how, why people are affected by the social structure, right? So again, sociology is the study of how, why people are affected by the social structure. We are all part of a social structure, right? Meaning that it's when we're talking about social structure, we're talking about an organized culture that is continuous. For example, right, when we look at the pharaohs here, what's important to keep in mind is that the language, custom, traditions might change, but the structure itself, right, the foundation of structure is always the same. Meaning that when you look at Egypt, right, or Babylonian times, you had the pharaohs, the priests, and the slaves, right? Medieval times, you had kings, lords, then you had knights, right, and and priests, merchants, and then at the very bottom you had the peasants. In contemporary society, you have upper class, middle class, lower class, right? So if you notice, is the terminology has changed, the groups themselves have changed, but the structure is continuous. It's still the same structure, right? And this is important because we're operating within the assumption that that we're going to get into a point where we can do away with structure, right? From a sociological frame, that can never happen, just because it's already ingrained into the system itself, right? So when we're talking about social structure, it's encompassing the way um, um, individuals are impacted by the group they belong to, and how the group, how how the individual itself impacts those groups, right? And so that is referred to as the butterfly effect. Okay, so the butterfly effect, is that if something happens to this individual, it will have repercussion effect within all these individuals will eventually make its way up, right? And vice versa. So if you notice is that in this system, in the social structure, everybody's depending on each other, right? And so just take a look at how we're trying to navigate our current situation, right? And so here within this hierarchy, right? Doesn't matter if you're a pharaoh or an unskilled laborer or a slave. Here, what happens down here will eventually, not, this is not to say that is spontaneous, right? It might take some time, but it will eventually impact those at the middle level, right? And vice versa. So that is the importance of a social structure. And again, sociology is a study of how and why people are affected by this particular structure. Okay. So what this means is that we look at interactions, where other disciplines focus on the individual internally. Sociology is focused on external factors, right? So hold on. Yay. All right. Okay. So why is this important? So let's go ahead and talk about this idea of reality. So within this particular social structure, we operate within this frame that the community, the structure itself constructs reality for us, right? So what this entails is that within this reality, there's a certain level of expectation, right? And this is this reality is truly ingrained within us, right? And so where we're looking at reality, we're in a sense talking about agents of society, right? Also known as agents of socialization, which we'll talk about later. And so agents of society are instruments, right? And within the structure that helps the structure get us integrated, right? And a good example is your family, right? Or my family. And the reason being is because here we learn that we're part of a collective, right? We're part of a community and individuals. And so also there's the emphasis on the idea of the individual, right? And that becomes very powerful. So when we're, I'm sorry, this thing turned off on me. So when we're talking about a construction reality, is that the object itself doesn't necessarily have to be real. What is real is the meaning of the object, right? So let's say if I was to look at this and I would say that I'm thinking of a dragon, right? And the dragon has a horn and has hooves, right? Has mane, and it gallops, right? Most of us say no, that's not a dragon. That's actually a unicorn, right? And so if I was to ask you, okay, show me where in the physical world that my definition of a dragon, right, of that it has a horn, it gallops, right, and it goes neigh, it is not a dragon, but a unicorn. Show me in the physical world where I can find a unicorn, right? We can't, okay? And the reason being is because it doesn't exist physically, but we all collectively, right, through the social construction of reality, we all collectively agree that this image here, it is not a dragon, it's an actual unicorn, right? Now, if it had wings, right, without the horn, then it'll become a Pegasus, right? But regardless, if you follow My Little Pony, it becomes an alicorn, right? But regardless, this object here doesn't exist in the physical world, but we gave it reality, right? We gave it meaning, therefore it exists. And so from a sociological frame, we give reality to meanings and to objects, right? And not only the reality, but we give it functions and what they're supposed to represent. Okay. For example, not only what they're supposed to represent, but what is the reaction, right? Or what is the comportment? So say, for example, in the classroom, right? If we were to engage in this conversation, right, there will be certain expectations of what the structure of the course would be, right? There are, even here, as we're engaged in Zoom or online, there's a certain level of expectation of what this interaction entails, right? And so that becomes very powerful, right? That even through cyberspace, this interaction becomes real, because it does have a reality to it. At the same time, this reality is very powerful because I'm envisioning you, the student, listening to me, right? Watching this video. So whereas in reality, I am looking into space, right? I'm looking into a wall that is behind my computer, but I don't see the wall, I see my students, right? And so that is the structure, that is how we now have constructed a sense of reality, right? And the second, again, when we get into globalization, we're going to talk about the role of technology and such. So what does this entail? What does this reality entail? Is that it operates in levels. It operates within what's called macro, right? Macro-micro relationships. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about what this means. Macro means big, right? So think of a distance. Macro means big, micro means small. For example, I am talking to you directly. This is a micro relationship, right? It's a micro relationship. If there was, and so anyone else not part of this conversation would be macro, right? Now, if we were in a classroom setting, right? And let's say, for example, let's see if I can draw here, right? So let's say, for example, I am standing here, right? And so this is a class, right? This is the class, and so and so you're a student, you're sitting here, right? If I'm speaking to you directly, this is the micro, right? The class, everybody else becomes the macro, right? Because they're part of the structure, but they're not in relation or direct interaction. But what we're talking about macro is that even as we're engaging in the small interaction, if you notice, is they're still part of the structure. And so this is why it's called macro-micro relationships, is that without this classroom, this interaction cannot happen, right? But at the same time, there's other forces going on here, right? Like say, for example, the language that we're communicating, right? And so later when we talk about language and such symbols, in the next lecture, I'll elaborate on that a little bit more, right? So now let's say, for example, that I was talking to this particular section of the class, then this now, all this becomes my micro, and this group over here becomes the macro, right? Because they're still part of the structure, but now my level of interaction it's only focused on this. Now, if I was again like in a lecture hall and addressing all the groups here, right? Then this will be the micro. And then you might be asking, well, what is the macro? Well, the macro will be the other classrooms in that particular building, right? Is that they're part of the building, they're part of the structure, right? Which is IUP, but they're not the ones who I'm directly interacting with. So they become my macro, right? So our macro micro relationship changes with our level of interaction, right? Or our level of analysis. And so that is important to keep in mind. Okay. So, when we're talking about constructing this reality, we're dealing within this particular frame. Now, this notion of reality is also impacted by other factors, right? And so let's go ahead and talk about those. Okay, so what other factors are impacting this reality and this relationship of macro and micro? And so let's go ahead and talk about globalization, right? Which globalization is something very macro, right? And so when we're talking about globalizations, your generation, it is actually confronted with two realities. One reality is that of being part of a nation state, right? The United States. At the same time, you're not part of a global community, right? And so this is why understanding globalization is important. Okay, and we're going to dive more into that a little bit later in this semester. Now, when we're talking about globalization, we're actually looking at different types of societies, right? And so what is a society? Society is a relationship bounded by space. And what we mean by space is it's geographical, right? And it persists over time, right? So when we're talking about society, it's an area that's defined, right? That has these particular boundaries of space. So this is physical space, right? But also in space in relation to cultural. And in a second, I don't really want to get into culture right now because that's actually part of the next lecture, which will be activating on Wednesday. But what this is saying is that when you look at the United States, right, our society is defined by a specific geographical location, but it's also defined by a space of ideological principle, right? Justice, fairness, and equality for all, right? Are our ideals, which is part of these components known as norms, right? So all societies have these norms. They're bounded by space in that retrospect. Now, societies also persist over time, meaning what might change is terminology. For example, when you look at the United States, say in 1920, right? And if you had a time machine to go back in 1920 and try to explain to someone from that time frame a cell phone, right, or an iPhone or an Apple computer, right, they will have no idea what you're talking about, right? Why? Because here the society itself is continuous, right, or is fixed. What is so the society persists over time, yet the components within it are always changing, right? And so the language is changing, the norms is changing, the customs is changing, the dialects are changing, right? Religions might be changing. So when we're talking about society, we're looking at an area that is specific, right? Bounded by space. Okay, and so that is a society. Okay. And so we use term as modern society. Okay, so so here in globalizations, we're looking at these different societies. So we're talking about areas that have their own kind of systems and identities that persist over times, right? And so that is now part of globalization. There's also within this globalization, aside from society, you have what's called the social processes. And so the social processes is how each and every single one of us gets integrated into a society. right? And so norms is ideals. Your norms are your attitudes, right? So when we're talking about norms, we're talking about attitudes, right? Society's attitudes, individual attitudes. And so here, when we're talking about norms, it is your attitudes, your beliefs, right? The way you see the world, and that also trigger behavior. Those are norms. Values is your ideology, right? What you perceive to be right and wrong, right? Those are your values. For example, the values, our values, right, as part of society, justice, fairness, and equality for all, right? That is the values. And so in a globalization, is that then here now you have also values that you must reflect, right, from a global frame. And so your first discussion forum, right, talks about some assumptions and kind of different societies and how individuals are integrated into different. Now, this is very important, again, for you, is because while your social process is of that of born in this great nation, right? You learn certain norms and values. At the same time, you're learning that you're part of a global community because of globalization, right? And so therefore, you are expected to learn the norms and values in a global context, right? Familiarize yourself with a different culture and a different settings. And the reason being is because you want to gain knowledge that then give you access to employment, right? Or mobility. And so this is now part of your reality, right? 80, 90 years ago, globalization was in its infant stage, right? A movement of individuals wasn't as rapid as it is today. For example, when you look at your technology, and we're going to get there in a second, it is that before information from, say, Taiwan would take weeks or months to appear in American media. Now it's instantaneously, right? Someone posts a video of something happening in Taiwan or in Indonesia or in Latin America, right? Or European in Europe, that it's instantaneous. And so again, because now you're part of that global community, right? And so the social processes for younger generations is very different than, say, from someone from my generation. All right. So when we're talking about globalization, what we're actually discussing is consumption. Okay. So when, and that is one of the key things of globalization. For example, your phone or your computer, right? It's the embodiment of globalization, in the sense that your phone or your computer, it could be assembled in the United States, but the parts might come from a different country, right? And X and Y and be shipped from X and Y, right? That is globalization. And so part of globalization is consumption, right? And so this argument is, well, can we get rid of globalization? The answer is no, because we can never get rid of consumption, right? Or do we even want to get rid of consumption? And so the consumption definition is a process by which people obtain goods and service, right? That is consumption. Okay. And so consumption is very powerful in contemporary society. And so because it gives this false narrative that individuals can buy things. And so with the power of consumption is that individuals might not necessarily have the power or the capital to buy, right, cash, but they do have the power to purchase things on credit, right? And so this is where you get into credit cards, right? So if you look at the interest rate of credit cards, until until very recently, I mean, like maybe in the last 10 years or so, credit cards have become regulated, or interest rates. Before that, there was no actual regulation of credit card. Even now, right, the interest rate is pretty high in credit cards when you take into consideration of how they operate. So and so credit card is this, again, right, this is construction reality, is operating with the assumption that we have this money, which we don't, right? That's why we get it on credit, because we don't have the actual cash to purchase this, right? But that is the purpose of consumption, is that the only way consumption can exist, specifically in globalization or in any society, is that it needs to be sustainable, right? That means it needs to be continuously operating, or else you start seeing collapses of economic models and such. And so if the individual doesn't have the capital, right, and so to purchase it, is that then it's in the promise that they'll be able to pay it off, right? And so the role of a credit card is debt, right? Because that's where the revenue comes from, right? And also control and power comes from debt, right? Is the reason why you continue working and this is, say for example, in a job you really might not actually enjoy, but like, wait, I got to pay off my bills, right? I got to pay off my credit card bills, my car payments and stuff. You do so because the debt, right? You continue operating within the system of debt. All right. And so so that is the power of consumption. Now, within globalization, this other manifestation that happens within is this thing called commodity fetish. And what commodity fetish is, that we give, again, going back to this idea of reality, is that we give meaning, commodity fetish is that we give meaning, powerful meaning to these objects, right? And so meaning, so think of, so we give meaning and importance to these objects that tend to be material, right? So that, like, say for example, your phone, right? Imagine you losing your phone, right? You're horrified at the idea of you losing your phone, just because aside from the information it had, it's your phone, right? You probably made it aesthetic to where you added certain things. You probably downloaded certain apps, right, that are specifically unique for you. That is what's called a commodity fetish, is that you're not looking for the function of the object. It's more of how the object makes you feel. And so your phone's function is to answer calls, right? That is its pure function. But there, the other apps and components to it, you add it because it makes you, it's an extension of you, right? In the classroom model, I ask, like, imagine yourself canoe, kind of going in a boat ride and down a river, right? And lo and behold, your cell phone drops it, kind of bloop, goes into the water. What do? More than half the class said they will dive, right? They'll go retrieve their phone. And so, then we have a conversation, like, just think of what just happened. You're risking your life, right, to retrieve a object that can be replaced, right? Now some say, well, there's some sensitive information, X and Y, right? But at the end of the day, it's a material object, right? At the end of the day, it's a material object. So as soon as say, yeah, but there's some pictures of certain individuals that I really miss that I haven't gotten a chance to download, right? And so, but what's important is that is commodity fetish, because we have extended the meaning of the object, right? I like going into YouTube, and I enjoy watching these videos of individuals comparing, say, phones, right? And some of you might have seen these, right? And, when you're determined to purchase which phone should you purchase, right? The Apple 20, or the Galaxy 203, right? I don't know what Galaxy phone we're at right now. And so you have these two similar phones, right? And someone, and there's a person there, saying, I'm going to press, and they press it together, like, okay, this one was a millisecond faster than this one, right? And the Pixar and all this, and it feels lighter, right? That's aesthetics, right? That's not the function, right? And so that is what commodity fetish is, right? And so and the reason being is because there's a disconnection to reality. For example, look at items or shirts or caps that said USA, right? So when has a proud eagle in the front, says USA, right? And, the big big bald eagle, right? With them, with the background Lady Liberty in the background, right? And then you look at the tag and it's made in China, right? That is the fetish, is that you associate with the United States. However, the material, the actual object itself, the reality of it, made in China, right? So that's what I mean by commodity fetish. Now, at the same time, within systems and societies and globalization, you have this thing happening called McDonaldization. And some of you might be asking, well, what does that entail? So McDonaldization is by Ritz. And so what Ritz argues is that institutions over time would try to find societies, right? Or institutions within societies would try to be more efficient, or they'll operate within a certain kind of universal approach. And he refers to this as McDonaldization. And so specifically, if you look at, say, the workforce, it's, or, even to a certain extent, education is McDonaldized. And what he's saying is that that it's this ideal rational approach to organizations, right? And so here, when Ritz is talking about rational approach, is that it's making accessible to everyone, right, through McDonaldization. And later we'll talk about different types of institutions and such. But what he's saying is that that when you look at organizations and they operate within what he, and the reason why he called it McDonaldization is because he was looking at McDonald's, right? And so what he's saying is that within the system, right, this rational system, the first thing that comes up, and these are the, and this particular conversation, right? And so if you look at the PowerPoints, right, there's notes at the bottom, and you'll find the notes for this one there. And the reason I'm gravitating to, I'm asking you to look at this note, because this is one of the questions for sure it's going to be on the exam. So so when you're looking at McDonaldization, it has 4 components. First one is efficiency, right? And so when we're talking about efficiency, think of assembly line, right? Is that everyone is just doing these specific tasks, right? It's being efficient, being fast, right? And so that is the goal, is fast. So think of if you're, for those of you who are here in the area and you're driving towards Blairsville, right, going to Pittsburgh, there's a big sign that talks about the waiting time in the hospital, right? Waiting room time, 2 minutes, right? That is emphasizing McDonaldization, because what they're pointing out is like, look, we're efficient, right? And so that is one of the components of McDonaldization, this idea of efficiency. The other component of it is that it tends to rely on calculating objects, right? Price. So again, when you're looking at McDonald's, right, the efficiency aspect is that everyone McDonald's has a specific task. You have someone in the register, you have someone in the grill, you have someone answering taking orders, right? And so if and then you have these individuals who are on the line and kind of assisting those who are in the back or those in the front, right? That is purpose of efficiency. At the same time, there's a certain price set on how much you pay for, say, for example, Big Mac, right? And so that is the price, right? So everything is calculated. So we're talking about calculatability, right? Everything has price. It's already been set. At the same time, in McDonaldization, you have predictability, meaning wherever you go in the United States, a Big Mac is going to be a Big Mac, right? And so you can expect the same type of quality or the similar ingredients, right? Now, let's say, for example, that you like your Big Mac is slightly different, then you ask for those you know, those particular items, right? Add this, take this out, right? But regardless, they're predictable. The other thing in McDonaldization is that there is control, right? So for example, here, this is now technology, right? Is that there's control of the freedom an individual can have, right? So just think of when you order something at McDonald's, right? And you ask them to make a slight change for it. They say, well, why can't you order this? And you're like, no, I want this, right? That is control. When they're asking for certain overrides, right? Like, oh, I need to get the manager to override this. And the manager comes over and they override that order, right? So you can add whatever you want to add. So that is McDonaldization. And so in here, in globalization, right now, again, we're moving into this technological component of society because society is changing, right? You know, through the social processes, and there's new integration because now we're part of a global community. And so now we're moving into McDonaldization, right? It's this expectation of structure, components, right? So, you know, there's argument as well, is higher education moving to McDonaldization? The argument is yes, right? Specifically when, you know, when institutions start pointing out like, oh, you can get your degree in 2.5 years, right? That is efficiency, right? Is that, you know, it's get them quick as possible. And so that there is that part of McDonaldization, okay? And so this is not only in the workforce, it's also in education, in the medical field, right? This idea of efficiency. How do we make our company more efficient, right? You hear that a lot, right? Okay, so when we're talking about consumptions, again, there, you know, what we're saying here is that there's a difference between citizens and consumers, right? Citizens is bounded by a geographical locality, right? So when we're talking about society, here what we're saying is that a citizen is bounded by the territory he or she occupies, right? They occupy a particular territory. Whereas a consumer is not bounded. It's anyone that consumes that product, right? And so agency versus power elites. When we're talking about agency, we're talking about institution. Power elites, you hear this term a lot. It is those 1%ers. Okay. Now the video that you're gonna watch in retrospect, sorry, you know, to consumerism, and so really emphasizes this idea now of globalization, right? And so because we, as a nation state, right, as Americans, we might operate within this idea like, oh, it's common sense. And so the video that you're gonna watch kind of push that boundary of common sense, right? Because for some of you who haven't traveled abroad, there's going to be some new kind of understanding of communications within different societies, right? And so sociology it is a science, and we use the scientific method, which we'll talk about that later. Not in particular in this lecture, but in actual lecture 2, we're going to dive into the methodology aspects of sociology. And so sociologists, we don't use common sense. And the reason being is because common sense changes within geographies, right? Demographic areas. And so what might necessarily be common sense society A might not be suitable common sense for society B. And an example could be that, let's say, for example, you sweat, right? You exercise, you sweat. What do? You take a bath, right? You take a shower, you take a bath. That's what common sense will tell you, right? Specifically, if you exercise a lot, then there's an expectation as well, you need to shower. Now, that might be true for the United States, but let's say, for example, you live in an area where water is scarce, right? You have very limited water. What does common sense tell you? Well, you don't take a bath, right? Common sense would tell you is you use salt, other herbs and powders, right, to get rid of the sweat and the odor, right? To, other ways to clean yourself aside from using water, right? And so if you notice here, you had a similar situation, right? how, and it had to do with sweat, right? Which was the similar scenario. The only difference is the geography, that in one area, common sense tells us to go in this direction, based in a different area, common sense will tell us, no, head down this direction, right? And so because we're dealing with different structures and different societies and norms and values, sociologists, we don't use common sense, right? We do use the scientific method. And so, that is key to know, right? And so this common sense component and structure in commodity-fed and globalization is specifically evident in the digital era, right? And so for example, just think of if for you, because of the socialization process you experience, right? You're more likely to understand how to turn on a computer or a cell phone, right? Or your TV, right? Your flat screen TV. Whereas someone who, say, for example, your great grandparent, right? Just because of their socializational process, right? The way they got integrated in society was very different, right? For you, common sense, like, oh, I see this little red button, I click and this is what I do, and this means this, right? I see this arrow, right? Simple, easy peasy, right? Common sense would tell you that, this is what you do. Whereas for your grandparents, that might not have, or for your great grandparents, right, where technology was in its early stages, right, specifically the internet and cell phones and such, right, they might not necessarily know the etiquette, right, and so technology is another component of this a realm of common sense, right. At the same time, technology is also changing the way we understand societies, because you can actually build communities, right? So think of, Facebook, right? In Facebook, you have your own community, you have your own groups. You develop what's called networks. Networks means information, the flow of information, right? The flow of information is through technology, and these new communities tend to be rapid, right? So here, networks is who what information you have, what information they have, and the way you share information. Now, information here, we're not talking about quality information. I'll give you an example. In the classroom, I've seen students on their cell phones, right? And I know for a fact, right, that, well, I shouldn't say that. There's a 99% probability they're not looking for the theoretical discussion of of astrophysics, right? Or they're not looking at Immanuel Kant conversation on metaphysics, right? And so there's a more likely chance what they're doing is that they're checking their Facebook or texting with a colleague or friend, from in a different in a different classroom, or in a different locality, right? And so here, information just means the flow. It doesn't mean that it's quality information, right? And studies show that while there's more information, the information individuals share is not quality information, meaning intellectual, insightful information. It's just information of what's happening to whom, right, and X and Y, right? So it's just kind of information in a sense that it's more to for emotional purpose, and then for knowledge purposes, right? Is that and so later when we talk about exchange, we're going to kind of make a distinction between those two. Is, well, what will constitute quality information, right? And this exchange value, right? And so technology has become a medium of interaction, right? So think of individuals who are sharing a physical space, right? So like, say, for example, you go out with your friends, you're sitting on a table, instead of interacting with each other, right? And you see this a lot, people are on their phones, right? So physically they're there, emotionally they're not there, right? They're somewhere else. And so that is how technology has now become a medium of interaction. And so when there was the dining hall, there by Foster, which now got kind of tore down right now. I think they're building a parking lot. There was I want to say maybe 5 gentlemen that were sitting around a table, and they were sitting there, but all of them were like on their own, on their phone. And so I introduced myself, I told them who I was and what department I belonged to, and I just asked them, like, I'm just curious to know, why, like, are you talking to each other? And they're like, no, I'm actually playing this game. And one individual like, no, we have a friend that couldn't be here. I'm actually texting them what we're doing, so that person was trying to get them into the circle. The other one's like, no, I'm actually scrolling, looking at my football team, see how they're doing, right there, their favorite football team. And so if you notice, that is, technology there has operated within that medium, right? So what does this happen? That even here, right, we have this macro and micro level of interaction, right? Even technology is that in your Facebook, you might have different, a plethora of individuals who are part of, on your Facebook friend list, right? But there's only might be a few individuals who you might interact, right? And then within a group, within that particular group, there is now a selective, right? So this is part of global, of technology, and how now through technology you can now interact. For example, for me, what stands out in the particular video that we're going to be discussing is how the person that the discussion forum is based is actually using it's in the digital world, right? We're actually going to be looking at a YouTube video, right? And so that is technology. And for me, that the fact that we're taking this kind of abstract component and integrating into social meaning and reality of interaction for this particular class, right? And so yes. Okay. So I think wait. All right, I knew we skipped something. There it is. Okay, so I don't know why we skipped that one. I was waiting for this one. All right, so we discussed how and that's why the jump from technology and society was pretty broad for me. So when we're talking about going back to McDonaldization, right, and the assembly lines. Okay, so just no, wait, why did it jump again? There he goes. So when we're talking about social processes, right, and how they, they're part of the social structure of societies, is that there's changes in the social world, right? And so let's go ahead and talk about social structure of time. And so let's look at feudal systems. So in feudal systems, the family structure was very different, right? So think of how in the feudal systems, trade was more important than just because of what was required, right? In this particular time, and the power in the feudal system was invested in the elders. Well, why in the elders? Well, they had the knowledge, right? So they would teach the younger generation how to harvest, how to plant, right? And the individuals who experience droughts and such, I'd be like, oh, you know what? This is how we handle the drought when I was a kid. And so structure a center around the elders, right? The elders had power in that retrospect. And then we start moving into industrialization, right? And industrialization, what became powerful, and we start seeing the shift, industrialization was, say, for example, in education, right? All of a sudden now you can't have kids work in the field, you had to move kids into the classroom, right? And so that way they can get trained on how to handle machinery. At the same time, individuals in rural areas, trying to be cool here. individuals in rural areas started moving into the city, right? Started moving here, right? They started moving into the city. So then the family dynamic changed because now you didn't have people working the farms, you had people moving into the city. And so then all of a sudden now you had a core family, right? And so the values of family started changing. Occasionally they would visit, um, they would visit their parents, right? Or grandparents. The kids would occasionally go and visit grandparents. But typically it was, now you had the nuclear family, right? And so the dynamic, the power of the elders, right, which would be the grandparents, right, started to wane into the core family. And then we experienced what's called post-industrial, right? And so this is when we move from industrialization, right, manufacturing stuff, to service industry, right? And so here you had now another shift, okay? You had a different shift. And then lastly, you had biotech. And what biotech is how science has now gotten integrated into our daily lives, right? So an example of this would be seedless watermelons. Okay, so I introduced my daughters to, we went visit some family in Texas because I'm originally from Texas. And, and so they were selling watermelons on the side of the road. Got a couple of watermelons and, reached our destination. I began carving them and started, handing it to my daughters. And immediately they're like, what is this? We're like, it's watermelon. And they're like, no, 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 no. We want the real ones. We're like, what do you mean the real ones? Like the ones without seed, right? And they were making reference to seedless watermelons just because here in Pennsylvania, we buy seedless watermelon for the girls. And so for them, that was their reality, right? That for them, the real watermelons were the ones without seed. The real oranges are the ones without seed. The real grapes for them is the one without seeds. And so in contemporary society, now we have what's referred to as a biotech system, right? And so if you notice that you had this gradual shift. And so what I'm trying to convey to you here is that just note that society is always changing and evolving, right? It's always in flux. Okay. So that was wait, hold on. What happened there? All right. So to recap. Society is a science that vets the formation of societies, right? So it's a critical examination of how societies are formed. Societies are organics, and in the process, it forms patterns of behavior, right? And so again, what we mean by organic is that it's always changing, it's always evolving, right? And so it's essential that in order to understand contemporary society, we need to understand technology and the way technology plays its role. For example, right now, technology is playing a particular role, right? And so this right here is now part of the socializational process. Imagine just 4 years ago, if someone say, "Hey, let's Zoom," you have no idea unless you follow the Flash, right? Wait, is their name Zoom? Okay, I need to verify that, right? But typically, just 3 or 4 years ago, someone will say, "Hey, let's Zoom." You have no idea what they were referring to. Why? Because that term, right, didn't have a reality, but now it has a reality. Okay, so that concludes today's conversation. And so just note that I do have office hours. And so a quick note, D2L, as I expressed before, has release conditions. You need to complete this video before D2L grants you access to the discussion forum. Just because the content in that discussion forum requires you to be able to make assessments based on our conversation right now. All right. So yeah, so that concludes our conversation. You have a phenomenal day, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye.